Trauma Therapist Podcast Plus listeners can listen to episodes early and ad-free right now. Become a Plus listener by going to Apple Podcasts, searching for the Trauma Therapist Podcast, and signing up today. All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started.
I'm ready. Let's do it.
All right. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. Very excited to have back Brad Kammer. Brad, welcome back.
Thank you, guys. So happy to be back and connecting with you again.
Awesome. So Brad is a California licensed marriage and family therapist and professional clinical counselor. He's trained as a somatic psychotherapist and has worked in the field of trauma for over 20 years, specializing in working with adverse childhood experiences and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Brad began his career as a humanitarian aid worker in Asia, which introduced him to personal and collective trauma. He's now the director of the Complex Trauma Training Center that provides training, consultation, and community for mental health professionals working with complex trauma. He's also a senior trainer in the neuroaffective relational model and provides NARM trainings through CTTC. Finally, he's a co-author of the Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma and also the executive producer of the podcast Transforming Trauma. Brad, welcome. A lot going on there.
That's right. I've been busy recently.
So before we get going here, remind our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
Well, originally I grew up mostly in Ohio, although I bounced around a lot when I was really young. But I went to elementary school, middle school, high school in Ohio, and then did a lot of different international travel and living abroad in different periods of my early adult life. And then I've been in Northern California for almost 20 years now. So I live about 2 hours north of San Francisco in a small town in Mendocino County.
Nice, nice. So brand new training center.
Yeah.
How did this come about? What's going on? Let our listeners know.
Yeah, it's super exciting for me. February 1st was our official launch date. And I've been the training director at the NARM Training Institute since we started that out. I've had really great fortune in my professional life to have some great mentors, including Dr. Lawrence Heller, who created the neuroaffective relational model, NARM. And we ended up partnering and creating this institute that we were bringing trainings, NARM trainings to all over the world. Even before COVID hit, we were doing online trainings and also in-person trainings. And then over the last couple of years, at the phase of Dr. Heller's career now, he's been moving much more in the direction of getting NARM much more out into the public awareness. So he's working on a couple movie projects, documentary projects. He's working with different residential centers, doing a lot of online teaching to general public and conferences. And me and my two colleagues, the other two faculty members, we really wanted to continue focusing on clinical development and really getting this work into the hands of more clinicians. And so it became apparent that in this very small organization that it was time to make some changes. And so it's really going to free both Larry's direction up and also our direction to create a new center that's really focused on doing this deeper support of clinicians through the Complex Trauma Training Center. So we will be continuing to do NARM trainings through our center, which is really exciting. And we're developing new programs that will be supporting the inner development of therapists so that they can stay healthy and stay effective in their work.
So let's talk more specifically about that. Talk to us about the philosophy of your center, what you're going to be teaching specifically. How are the therapists going to benefit? What can they learn?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's, I've taught intro to psychology at colleges for many years, and I'm like kind of a nerd about the history of psychotherapy. I just love learning about it, and one of the things that happened very early before psychoanalysis was really even a very formulated model is that Freud used to have these Wednesday evening get-togethers at 8:30. He was very kind of strict about time, so he would invite folks over at 8:30 at night, and they would sit in his in his family room or whatever, and they would start coming up with these ideas about what later became psychoanalysis. And these were the earliest meetings that then turned into the Vienna Psychoanalytic Institute or Society. And then, in different countries and all around the world, they started developing these psychoanalytic institutes that had a number of different functions. It was to train clinicians. It was to do research. It was to promote advocacy, to get the work out into the world more. It was social connection, developing community because it was still a very new profession. And that lasted up until the 40s, 50s, into the 60s.
Huh.
There are still some left, but in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, as people stopped getting trained so much in psychoanalysis, graduate school started to kind of really replace a lot of that, where people were getting more introduced to different models. And so, what I've observed in the 25 years that I've been in the field is that there's really kind of three holes that happen when clinicians come out of graduate school. One is that they just haven't developed a lot of clinical training. It's amazing, actually, how little clinical training a lot of people graduating from graduate school or even finishing their internship receive. So clinical training is why so many people are searching out for models like NARM or IFS or somatic
Hmm.
experiencing or EMDR. So that's one of the holes. The other hole, the second hole is ongoing support. Most states in the United States don't require clinicians to get any kind of supervision once they've completed their license. I myself think that's highly unethical. In this profession, particularly when you're working with trauma, it's just evoking so much inside of us. I mean, so many of your guests talk about that. And I think it's really important that we get some kind of ongoing support to take care of our own inner world, but also to be more effective with our clients. And then the third hole that I see is really the community aspect.
Hmm.
Many people end up working in private practice and don't even know the other people in their building, often don't have much real in-person community. Maybe they have a little online community. And then even people that work at centers or clinics, they have other clinical staff around them, but they often don't share kind of the same perspectives or understanding. At some centers, you have to adhere to the framework that they use. And so people kind of are afraid to be creative or afraid to be authentic in themselves. And so developing a community of professionals that can come together to support each other, not just for networking and for business, but also for emotional support in this
Hmm.
field, since we can't bring it home to our spouses or to our friends because it's all confidential. All of that feels so critical in the era we're living in with such fragmentation.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, as I'm listening to you enumerate these different pillars, I'm thinking to myself, I haven't really heard people talk about within this context the real need for consultation. Yes, people talk about, but when you hear it, it's always an add-on. I mean, you're talking about the necessity, the it's integral.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So how is this going to work? This is on. We're talking about an online platform you're providing.
Yeah, we do some in-person trainings, but most of our program offerings are all online. So I'll just take you through the three different kind of levels I
Please.
just talked about. So clinical trainings, we're focusing on NARM trainings, on the
Okay.
neuroaffective relational model, and again, most of those are online, though we do have some that are in person. And that is clinical development. So we do a lot of both theory, but also half of the training is really supporting them with individualized support, which we call active coaching. So we sit with a therapist who's working with a client, and we really break down the whole clinical process, which again is not something that people are really getting a lot of when they become therapists. So we do clinical trainings. The second part about ongoing support is we offer monthly consult groups. We don't call them supervision because it's kind of a different relationship, but ongoing consult groups. We do these ongoing active coaching groups, which is that people come together online and we'll choose a therapist and a client, and one of the teachers will work with the therapist while they're working with the client and allow us to really deconstruct and look at all the different choice points. And so people really like getting that active coaching. And then we also do webinars, we do demonstration groups. So we have different ways that people can plug in as much or as little as they'd like to on an ongoing basis so that they can get support for to bring back to their practice. And then the third level of community is developing community events, whether those are retreats or they're workshops that people are requesting, or we've had musicians come on and we'll get the community together, and the musician will talk about how trauma has impacted them and the art that they've
Wow.
developed. I mean, all kinds of different things that we can stay connected. And of course, all the different Facebook groups and all that stuff as well.
So, who specifically is this for? What kind of clinician, therapist, mental health provider?
Yeah, I mean, the title is Complex Trauma Training Center. So, I think probably the target market would be therapists who are working with clients with complex trauma, which I think is pretty much everyone.
Right.
I mean, it depends. There's a lot of debate, as you know, in the field of trauma, where some people think we're defining it too broadly, some think we're defining it too narrowly. So, a lot of it is for helping people understand how we work with the impact of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma, developmental trauma, cultural trauma, intergenerational trauma. So yeah, therapists that are looking for further training or a community or ongoing support, graduate students that are eager to learn more about trauma. I think both you and I were eager early in our career to learn about it. Interns, bringing
Okay.
it.
So they don't have to be licensed.
No,
Okay.
exactly. Yep.
Okay. Now, I think a lot of people here maybe don't know or aren't familiar with NARM and its trainings. Can you just give us like a thumbnail sketch of what is NARM? How is it differentiated from, you mentioned somatic experiencing or sensory motor psychotherapy?
Yeah. Yeah, well, obviously, there's a lot of overlap on those three that you mentioned because they all have kind of a common lineage. They all have roots in somatic psychology. So Pat Ogden, who created sensory motor psychotherapy, Peter Levine, who created somatic experiencing, and Lawrence Heller, who created NARM, they all actually, all of them lived in Colorado in the 70s and 80s. So they literally come from the same lineage of what was happening in the Denver Boulder area back then. So NARM is really specifically designed for working with complex PTSD. And I know we've talked about this in other times we've met, but there's really three main categories that they've added to the original PTSD diagnosis. And the three categories have to do with affect dysregulation, interpersonal difficulties, and negative self-concept. And so these are the three differentiating factors from what we often call shock trauma, which is PTSD. And of course, most of our clients have an intersection of both shock trauma and complex trauma. So it's great to be trained in models that are specifically designed for shock trauma and models that can work with complex PTSD. And as far as we're aware, I mean, NARM is one of the first models that specifically designed through this lens of working with CPTSD. The diagnosis hasn't even been officially recognized in North America yet. So, we're ahead of the game in a certain way. So NARM really works with these adaptive patterns that we carry forth mainly through childhood, although, of course, trauma can happen at any stage of our life, but often through these developmental patterns, these relational patterns that then we carry into adolescence, into adulthood, and they impact all aspects of our life. They impact our relationships. They impact how we feel about ourselves and the way we regulate ourselves in our life. And so NARM is what we often call a top-down, bottom-up model. We're working both with somatic elements and how people are experiencing dysregulation, but we're also working with elements of identity and how people are organizing themselves that are keeping themselves stuck in different ways. And then, of course, the R in NARM is the relational aspect that there's, from our perspective, if you're working with relational trauma, we have to bring in the relational elements that are happening between the therapist and the client as well.
So people who, let's say, are interested in joining the Complex Trauma Training Center, they're going to come in, and how do they enter? How do they join? What are they going to do? Are they going to have a choice of how they interact? Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, many pathways. And again, people can be as engaged or as little engaged as they want to. I mean, that's an important thing for us. A lot of trainings, are these huge commitments. I have a colleague and friend who just went to study Jungian work, and she is now studying in Switzerland. It's a 6-year program. I mean, a 6-year intensive program.
Right.
Not many people can do that as adults in our society. So we're trying to make it that you don't have to sign up and give your life over to one particular training. So there's different pathways or different on-ramps. People can just come in and be part of our consult groups, or people can come in. We do these webinars. And so, for example, the next webinar we'll be doing in May is about complex trauma and eating disordered patterns. We did one last month on complex trauma and dissociative identity disorder. So these are on-ramps that people who don't even have any training or further engagement with us can enter in. A lot of people come in because they are seeking training in NARM. They've heard about it in different ways. And so that is a lot of how people do. They sometimes will take one of our workshops first to kind of learn a little bit about NARM, and then they'll sign up for one of our 1-year trainings. And then they can go further from that point if they choose to. But so there's, and then the podcast, of course, there's many different on-ramps that people can come and engage with us. So,
I know I've asked this before, but you're obviously so passionate about this. How the heck do you keep your interest and passion alive in this work?
Yeah, I love that question. I mean, it's my own relationship to my own trauma, and I was doing things before I even understood the word trauma that were all about trying to regulate myself or trying to learn to grow and shift these patterns. And I just feel very committed to doing that both for myself and also helping people that are interested in doing that both for themselves and also if they're therapists or clinicians to help their clients do that. And the cool thing about this field is that it's just really still very much in its infancy. I mean, like we talked about before, CPTSD hasn't even become officially recognized yet. So I just find it really exciting. And over the last 5 or 10 years, it has been interesting to see trauma becoming much more of a household name, and TikTok and all this stuff. Bessel van der Kolk's book has been on the Amazon bestseller for 10 years now, I believe. And yeah. I'm a strong advocate for continuing to get this work out there. And I know there's pushback in different ways. There's the number one book I just read this morning on Amazon is a book called Bad Therapy, which is about I don't want to not do justice to it because I haven't read the book, but I did listen to the podcast, and it's basically kind of an attack on some of the trauma-informed movement and therapy, over therapizing people in our society. And I just have a very different perspective that I think that we are a very non-self-reflective society, which is why we act out our inner stuff all over the place. And the more we can help both adults and children learn to look inward and deal with some of the, unresolved material inside, we can make the world a better place. And so for me, I'm not so much, when I was younger in my life, I was much more kind of politically out there and trying to change larger systems. And now I really believe in the ripple effect of working with clients and changing it from the ground up.
I love that. So when you work with people, let's say you work with people who haven't really done a lot of education around learning about trauma and so forth. What do you see in a lot of the maybe the younger therapists or people who are just learning? What do you see when they come to you for education and so forth?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I see people that are also very passionate. I mean, our field is just, I mean, as you know more than I do, I mean, we just have some incredible people in our field that have dedicated their lives to helping others heal. And, this isn't a big money making business for the most part. I mean, we're just doing the best we can to help people. And I just find it very inspiring that people are willing to make these commitments to develop themselves and to bring this work to other people. I would say I do have some critiques. I mean, I think it's like anything, pendulum shift. And I think that there was a really important movement that happened in the 60s and 70s and still today that we became much more empathic as therapists and started, stopped kind of interpreting other people's experiences and started to like
Mm-hmm.
bring more understanding and compassion and care. And in NARM, we talk about something called unmanaged empathy that, a lot of therapists can actually be using empathy as part of an adaptive strategy. For example, many of us who become therapists kind of played that role in our younger life. We were taking care of people. And that's why we're so good at it as we get older. But it also has some cost, both costs because unmanaged empathy can burn ourselves out very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And also because it can lead us to acting out, even with the best of intentions. We can choose sides in people's lives in ways that might not be supportive. We can get very pulled into enactments. I'm very passionate about helping therapists learn more about therapeutic enactments that are happening between them and clients that are often pretty unconscious.
Give
Uh,
us an example of that. What does that look like?
yeah, I mean, we talk a lot about two different kinds of enactments. One has to do with kind of transference patterns. So, a client is expecting us to be a rejecting person because they've had all these experiences of rejection. I mean, we get clients who I've been to 25 therapists and they fired me, and I'm getting fired from jobs and in relationships, and so there's a way that then we can get pulled in both or either directions, either to become like the rewarding kind of surrogate that is going to make sure that we're going to be the savior and help
Mm-hmm.
this client no matter what, which often has a lot of costs to us. Or we kind of start to resonate with the part that is kind of rejecting of the client, and we can start to become cynical or resentful, or we look at our schedule and we have that dread of seeing that client that day. I think a lot of us have had that. So, there's a lot of different forms of enactment that, and I always say it takes two to be in an enactment, which means that clients will always be coming in and inviting us to walk into an enactment, and it's on us. We can't change our clients. So it's on us to figure out where our hooks are
Mm-hmm.
and getting pulled in. And like for my personal example, I talk about like a lot of therapists struggle with clients who have addictive disorders. And because I didn't grow up with that, that wasn't part of my history growing up, that there's very little hooks for me around addiction. But my joke here is that if you put a narcissistic client in front of me, I got hooks all over the place. It's like I'm in a field of landmines because I grew up with a lot of narcissism. So we all have different kind of hooks and getting to know those. And then just the last enactment we talk about, the second enactment we talk about is parallel process, which is, for example, let's say, your best friend has been going through chemotherapy for the last couple of years. You've been by their side, and they just passed away in the last, month or two, and you're still grieving the process. And then you get a client that's coming to you who's in the middle of chemotherapy. That's very likely going to kind of evoke difficulty for you to really stay present, both for yourself and
Mm-hmm.
with the client. And so how do we work with these parallel process? Or I'm working on a class that I'm teaching next week, and the example I give is a client's just found out that their partner cheated on them, and the therapist has had a recent infidelity in their relationship as well, and it can be very difficult to hold neutrality and openness and curiosity when you're getting activated in a very similar way that your client is, and that's just so rich, and it's not really clinical. There's not really a clinical model for that. It's really more about this inner landscape of us getting to know more about ourselves so that we can see these patterns more clearly and where we're getting hooked into them.
Yeah, I love all that. And of course, that is not easy for a lot of us.
No.
It's self-awareness and do your work. Your work, and we always use those phrases, but how friggin' hard and challenging is that to do?
Exactly.
And to be able to be in the moment when you work with a client.
No, exactly. I always thought, like, you learn these different models, and often the clinical model will start with something like this. They'll say something like, once the relational attunement is set up, then you start doing this, this, and this. And I was always like, well, you can't just do that. You can't just say that. You can't assume that the relationship is going to be built. And I think that I know there's been a lot of talk from Rogers on about like what really helps in a therapeutic relationship. But I think a lot of therapists here, another critique here of mine, a lot of therapists, we assume that because we're so empathic, we're really good relationally. And empathy is just one aspect of relationship. I think there's a lot of aspects to it that we really need to deconstruct. And some of them we are really good at, and some of them we need to strengthen and we need to get better at. And I think that that's part of what's getting missed a lot as we move towards models that are, more evidence-based and less relationally oriented.
Love it. Love it. So the Complex Trauma Training Center, how do people find out about this?
Yeah, well, of course, the easiest way is the website, complextraumatrainingcenter.com. We're really proud of our podcast. I've told Guy this before for all those listening to me for the first time, but I've modeled in some ways our podcast on your podcast because I just find it to be incredible how you've created this and the content and the people. So, we've tried to kind of capture a similar spirit. It's called Transforming Trauma, and we also have presence on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube. We put all of our podcasts up there, and we have some other videos up there. And also, the book that Larry and I created that came out in 2022 called The Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma. For anyone that specifically wants to learn about NARM, that book and the book that came before that called Healing Developmental Trauma would also be good specifically for learning more about NARM.
Awesome. Okay. We'll have each of those linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Brad, man, super inspiring, dude. I'm so excited. Really, I'm so excited for this new training center, and I can't think of a better person to have at the helm than you. Yeah, I'm excited to help support you in any way I can, and look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, well, you already have, and yes, thank you so much. That really touches me. So great,
all right, brother,
connecting with you. Yeah.
All right, take care.
Thanks. You too.